Ironically, the loneliest person in the grand ballroom was not the man everyone feared, but the woman everyone was too afraid to greet. The ballroom of the Fairmont Grand Hotel shimmered beneath towering crystal chandeliers, where golden light reflected across polished marble floors and elegant tables dressed in white linen. Soft piano music drifted through the room while distinguished business leaders, politicians, philanthropists, and international guests exchanged polished smiles beneath the quiet confidence that only wealth and influence seemed to create. At the center of the gathering stood Ethan Brooks, a 44-year-old Korean Mafia boss whose reputation reached far beyond Chicago. Dressed in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, he greeted guests with calm professionalism, speaking only when necessary, his measured voice carrying an authority that required no explanation. Every handshake seemed deliberate. Every nod commanded respect. No one questioned his presence, and no one dared underestimate him. Yet only a short distance away, near a large window overlooking the city's glowing skyline, sat his 71-year-old mother, Margaret Brooks. She wore a graceful navy blue evening dress beneath a light pearl shawl, her silver hair carefully arranged, a small family brooch resting gently near her shoulder. She looked every bit as elegant as the women surrounding her, yet one difference separated her from everyone else in the room. She was completely alone. Guests noticed her. Many quietly recognized who she was. Some smiled politely from across the ballroom before quickly turning their attention elsewhere. Others lowered their voices whenever they passed nearby, unwilling to risk saying the wrong thing to the mother of a man whose influence made even the most accomplished executives choose their words carefully. Waiters approached only long enough to refill her tea before respectfully stepping away. No one asked how she was enjoying the evening. No one offered to sit beside her. No one treated her as an ordinary elderly woman attending a charity gala. Instead, they treated her as though an invisible wall surrounded her chair. Margaret noticed everything, yet her gentle smile never disappeared. She quietly watched couples laughing together, old friends embracing, and strangers becoming acquaintances over shared conversations. Occasionally her eyes drifted toward Ethan, who remained surrounded by important guests discussing charitable projects, investment opportunities, and community partnerships. She understood why he could not leave those conversations. His responsibilities had always demanded more from him than most people would ever understand. She did not blame him. In fact, she felt proud every time she saw him helping others through the influence he had built over many years. Still, she missed something much simpler than admiration. She missed ordinary conversation. She missed asking someone where they had traveled from or complimenting a beautiful dress or hearing a young person speak excitedly about dreams for the future. Long before her son became one of the city's most respected figures, Margaret had spent more than 3 decades teaching elementary school children, believing that every meaningful relationship began with one sincere greeting. Tonight, however, even a simple hello seemed impossible. Across the ballroom, Ethan happened to glance toward the window. For only a brief moment, his eyes met his mother's gentle expression. She smiled warmly and gave him the smallest reassuring nod, silently telling him not to worry. Ethan returned the smile, but something inside him quietly tightened. He suddenly realized that despite filling an entire ballroom with powerful people, he had unknowingly left the one person who mattered most sitting alone. And before the evening was over, one quiet moment would change not only the atmosphere inside the ballroom, but the way everyone present understood the difference between fear and genuine respect. Across the ballroom, conversations continued flowing as though nothing unusual had happened, yet Ethan could no longer ignore the quiet picture near the window. Every time he accepted another handshake or listened to another congratulatory remark, his attention drifted back toward his mother sitting alone with remarkable grace. He had spent years building influence through discipline, careful decisions, and unwavering confidence. That influence had opened doors for charities, protected thousands of employees, and earned the respect of people who rarely respected anyone. Yet tonight, for the first time in many years, he wondered whether that same reputation had quietly created a barrier around the person he loved most. Ethan understood why people behaved the way they did. They were not intentionally unkind. Most simply feared making a mistake. They worried about saying something inappropriate, asking the wrong question, or appearing too familiar with the family of a man whose presence naturally commanded caution. Fear disguised itself as politeness, and politeness slowly became distance. Margaret noticed it too, but unlike her son, she viewed people with remarkable generosity. She had spent decades standing before classrooms filled with children who arrived carrying different fears every morning. Some feared failure. Others feared embarrassment. Many simply feared being misunderstood. She had learned long ago that kindness usually began by helping someone feel safe enough to speak. Sitting quietly with both hands wrapped around a warm porcelain teacup, Margaret watched the room with gentle curiosity instead of disappointment. Every guest reminded her of former students who had eventually found their own paths through life. A young attorney nervously introducing herself to community leaders reminded Margaret of a shy little girl who had once hidden behind library shelves during recess. An elderly businessman laughing loudly beside the orchestra brought back memories of a mischievous boy who could never sit still during reading lessons. She smiled softly at the memories, grateful that age had given her the ability to see people beyond titles and appearances. Across the room, several guests quietly noticed her warm expression. One couple briefly considered walking over to introduce themselves before hesitating at the last moment. A nonprofit director picked up her glass, took 2 steps toward Margaret, then quietly changed direction after noticing Ethan speaking with several influential guests nearby. Even experienced community leaders who spent their lives talking comfortably with strangers suddenly became uncertain. They respected Ethan deeply, but respect mixed with intimidation often produced silence instead of connection. Ethan finally excused himself from a conversation about a hospital fundraising initiative and slowly crossed part of the ballroom, intending to spend a few moments beside his mother. Before he could reach her, another group of international donors politely approached him with questions regarding future charitable partnerships. Ethan welcomed them with his usual professionalism, but his eyes instinctively searched for Margaret again. She simply smiled from across the room and gave another reassuring nod, silently encouraging him to continue his responsibilities. She had always understood the weight her son carried. She had also taught him that serving others sometimes required personal sacrifice. Ethan returned his attention to the conversation, although a quiet feeling of regret remained. Near Margaret's table, a young hotel server carrying a silver tray of sparkling water approached carefully, glancing toward the elegant elderly woman before lowering her eyes. The server seemed to want to say something, yet uncertainty held every word inside. Margaret noticed the hesitation immediately. She offered the young woman the same patient smile she had once shared with the frightened first-grade students on their very first day of school. Neither of them realized that within the next few moments, one simple exchange would gently dissolve the invisible wall surrounding that quiet corner of the ballroom. The young hotel server stopped beside Margaret's table, balancing the polished silver tray with careful hands. She could not have been older than 22, and although her uniform was perfectly pressed, her nervous expression revealed how overwhelmed she felt by the elegant evening surrounding her. She had spent the last hour quietly serving influential guests whose names regularly appeared in newspapers and business magazines. Speaking confidently to them seemed impossible enough. Speaking to the mother of Ethan Brooks felt even more intimidating. "Would you like some sparkling water, ma'am?" she asked softly, keeping her eyes respectfully lowered. Margaret smiled with the same warmth that had comforted generations of children inside her classroom many years earlier. "Thank you, dear," she replied gently. "That would be lovely." The young server carefully lifted a crystal glass from the tray, but as another guest unexpectedly stepped behind her, she lost her balance for only a brief second. The edge of the tray shifted. A glass tilted sideways. Cold sparkling water spilled across the white linen tablecloth before splashing lightly onto Margaret's folded pearl shawl. Time seemed to pause. The server's face instantly turned pale. Several nearby guests gasped quietly before taking a cautious step backward. One gentleman instinctively reached for a stack of linen napkins while another exchanged worried glances with his wife. Across the ballroom, Ethan noticed the sudden movement near his mother's table. His conversation stopped in the middle of a sentence as his eyes fixed on the scene. The young server immediately placed the tray onto a nearby service station and reached for fresh napkins with the trembling hands. "I am so sorry," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I truly did not mean to do that. Please forgive me." Margaret looked first at the frightened young woman instead of the water soaking gently into her shawl. She recognized the expression immediately. It was the same look she had seen countless times when a child accidentally spilled paint across a classroom floor or dropped an important school project. Fear had nothing to do with the mistake itself. Fear came from imagining the consequences before anyone had spoken a single word. Margaret slowly accepted one of the linen napkins and gently patted the fabric without the slightest trace of frustration. Then she looked directly into the young server's anxious eyes and smiled with a complete sincerity. In a calm, reassuring voice, she quietly spoke a single Korean word. "Gwaenkana." The young woman blinked in surprise, clearly unfamiliar with the language. Margaret repeated it with the same gentle smile. "Gwaenkana." Her voice carried no disappointment, no criticism, and no impatience. Only kindness. The surrounding guests fell completely silent, uncertain what the word meant yet somehow understanding its emotion before its translation. The tension that had gripped the corner of the ballroom seemed to loosen almost instantly. Even the musicians appeared to soften their playing as the quiet moment unfolded. The young server hesitated before asking almost in a whisper, "What does that mean?" Margaret's smile grew warmer. "It means, it is all right." The server's eyes began to glisten with relief. Across the ballroom, Ethan remained perfectly still. He watched his mother comfort someone who believed her evening had been ruined, and in that simple moment, he realized she had accomplished something that all his influence, reputation, and authority never could. She had made another human being feel safe again. Around them, several guests who had been too afraid to approach Margaret only moments earlier found themselves quietly taking a step closer, drawn not by power, but by the extraordinary peace carried within one simple word. The young server took a slow, unsteady breath as the meaning of the unfamiliar Korean word settled into her heart. She looked at Margaret with grateful disbelief, as though she had expected embarrassment but had been given compassion instead. "It is all right," she repeated quietly, almost testing the words herself. Margaret nodded gently. Sometimes people need to hear those words more than they need someone to clean the table. A soft laugh escaped the young woman, and for the first time that evening, the fear disappeared from her face. Nearby guests who had witnessed the exchange found themselves smiling as well. The tension that had quietly filled the corner of the ballroom dissolved into something warmer, something far more human. One elderly couple approached Margaret's table, no longer uncertain about whether they should interrupt. The gentleman offered a polite smile. "That was a beautiful word," he said. "I did not understand it, but I understood exactly what you meant." Margaret welcomed them with the same kindness she had shown the young server. "Language can help us. Comunicate," she replied softly, "but kindness is something every heart understands." The couple accepted her invitation to sit for a few moments, and before long, another guest joined the conversation. Then another. Questions slowly replaced hesitation. Someone asked where Margaret had grown up. Another wondered how long she had lived in the United States. A young nonprofit volunteer asked whether she still spoke Korean every day. Margaret answered every question with a quiet enthusiasm, occasionally sharing small memories from her childhood and smiling whenever someone expressed genuine curiosity about her heritage. Across the ballroom, Ethan watched the remarkable transformation with silent amazement. Less than 15 minutes earlier, the table near the window had stood completely alone. Now gentle laughter drifted from that corner of the room, blending naturally with the piano music. Guests who had spent the entire evening carefully avoiding Margaret now seemed perfectly comfortable speaking with her, not because they had suddenly become braver, but because she had removed the fear they had carried without realizing it. Ethan found himself reflecting on something his mother had often told him when he was a little boy. People rarely remember the smartest person they meet, she used to say. They remember the person who made them feel safe. At the time, he had never fully understood those words. Tonight, watching complete strangers relax in his mother's presence after hearing only one gentle sentence, he finally understood the lesson she had been teaching all along. The young server returned a few minutes later carrying a fresh pot of tea. This time her hands no longer trembled. She poured the tea carefully before smiling at Margaret. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "I think I will remember that word for the rest of my life." Margaret reached over and gently touched the young woman's hand. "Then promise me one thing," she said with a warm smile. "The next time someone around you makes an honest mistake, give them the same gift." The server nodded without hesitation. "I will." Several nearby guests quietly exchanged thoughtful glances, recognizing that they had just witnessed something much greater than a simple conversation. They had watched one act of compassion ripple from one person to another without anyone raising their voice or seeking attention. As Ethan slowly began walking toward his mother's table, he realized the evening was no longer centered on influence, wealth, or reputation. It had become a lesson in humanity, and every person in the ballroom was now waiting to hear what Margaret might say next. As Ethan finally reached the table, the small circle of guests naturally stepped aside, not because they feared him, but because they wanted him to share the moment they had just experienced. Margaret looked up at her son with the same gentle smile she had worn since the beginning of the evening. "You look tired," she said quietly. Ethan smiled in return, something that happened far less often than most people realized. "I think I have been learning tonight," he answered. The guests exchanged warm smiles, surprised to witness such an ordinary conversation between a man whose reputation often made him seem larger than life and the woman who still looked at him exactly as she had when he was a little boy. One of the non-profit directors finally gathered the courage to ask a question that had quietly remained on everyone's mind. "Mrs. Brooks," she said respectfully, "how did your son become the man he is today?" Ethan instinctively looked toward his mother, curious to hear her answer. Margaret rested both hands around her teacup before speaking. When Ethan was 8 years old, he came home from school very upset because another student had laughed at a classmate who struggled to read. He wanted to know why people were so unkind. She paused for a moment as the ballroom grew completely silent. "I told him that strength is never measured by how powerful you become. It is measured by how gently you treat someone who cannot offer you anything in return." Ethan lowered his eyes with a quiet reflection. He remembered that conversation perfectly. He also remembered how many times his mother had repeated that lesson throughout his childhood whenever he became frustrated or impatient. Margaret continued softly. "Success changes many people. It gives them opportunities, influence, and responsibility. But if success ever makes you forget the value of ordinary kindness, then it has already taken something much more important away from you." No one spoke. Even the nearby piano seemed to fade into the background as every person absorbed her words. The young hotel server stood only a few feet away, listening with complete attention. She realized that the remarkable man everyone admired had not been shaped only by difficult experiences or ambitious goals. He had first been shaped by quiet conversations around a family dinner table. Ethan reached for his mother's hand without saying anything. The simple gesture spoke more clearly than any public speech ever could. Margaret smiled and gently squeezed his hand before turning back toward the guests. "Do not admire my son because people know his name," she said kindly. "Admire every person who still chooses compassion after life gives them reasons to become cold." Several guests nodded thoughtfully. One elderly businessman quietly removed his glasses to wipe away unexpected tears. The non-profit director smiled through glistening eyes. Even the young server stood a little taller, carrying herself with a confidence that had not been there earlier that evening. Ethan looked around the table and noticed something remarkable. No one seemed interested in discussing business, influence, or social status anymore. Instead, complete strangers were introducing themselves to one another, sharing family stories, laughing softly, and speaking with the natural ease that had been missing at the beginning of the gala. Watching the transformation unfold, Ethan understood that his mother's greatest gift had never been teaching children inside a classroom. It had always been teaching every person she met how to become a little more human. And although the evening had already changed in ways no one expected, Margaret had one final story waiting in her heart that would quietly transform the entire ballroom before the night came to an end. Margaret looked around the table with a quiet appreciation, allowing a comfortable silence to settle before speaking again. She had learned long ago that the most meaningful lessons often arrived after people stopped trying to impress one another. The guests leaned in naturally, not because anyone had asked for their attention, but because they genuinely wanted to hear what she would say next. Margaret smiled gently. "May I tell you a story?" Every person around the table nodded. Even those standing several feet away found themselves listening. "Many years ago," she began, "I had a little boy in my classroom who struggled to make friends. Every afternoon he sat alone during lunch because the other children believed he was too quiet. One day I asked another student to sit beside him. That little girl told me afterward that she had been nervous because she did not know what to say. He simply told her to begin with one kind question." Margaret's eyes softened as she remembered the moment. The next day they laughed together. By the end of the school year they had become inseparable friends. Nothing extraordinary happened that afternoon. One child simply decided to make another child feel welcome. She paused as several guests smiled quietly, recognizing how often life changed through simple moments rather than dramatic ones. "Since then," Margaret continued, "I have never underestimated the power of a greeting, a smile, or a few reassuring words. Most people carry burdens we cannot see. Sometimes kindness is the only thing that reminds them they are not carrying those burdens alone." Ethan listened carefully, remembering countless evenings during his childhood when his mother returned home from school with stories about students whose lives had slowly changed because someone had believed in them. He realized those stories had quietly shaped every important decision he had made as an adult, even when he had not consciously recognized their influence. The young hotel server stepped forward with renewed confidence. "Mrs. Brooks," she asked softly, "were you ever afraid that people would ignore your kindness?" Margaret smiled. "Kindness is never wasted. Sometimes it changes another person immediately. Sometimes it takes years. Either way, it always leaves the world better." Then it found it. The words settled gently across the ballroom. Nearby conversations had nearly disappeared as more guests drifted closer, drawn by the peaceful atmosphere surrounding Margaret's table. A city council member introduced himself. A retired teacher shared memories from her own classroom. A young entrepreneur admitted she had been too intimidated to approach Margaret earlier in the evening and thanked her for making everyone feel welcome. Margaret greeted each person with genuine curiosity, asking about their families, their work, and what had brought them to the charity gala. Every conversation felt sincere because she listened more than she spoke. Ethan quietly noticed something remarkable. Earlier that evening people had approached him because of his reputation. Now they approached his mother because of her warmth. Respect built on influence had opened doors, but kindness had invited people inside. Looking around the ballroom, Ethan understood that the atmosphere had completely transformed. Guests who had once remained carefully separated now stood together exchanging stories, introducing friends, and laughing with an ease that had been absent only an hour before. Margaret looked at her son and offered the same gentle smile she had given him since he was a little boy. Without saying another word, she reminded him of the lesson that had guided her entire life, and Ethan realized that the greatest legacy anyone could leave behind was not fear, admiration, or success, but the simple ability to make another person feel seen. As the evening continued, something remarkable happened without anyone announcing it. The invisible distance that had surrounded Margaret for most of the gala simply disappeared. Guests no longer approached her table with hesitation. They arrived carrying genuine curiosity, warm smiles, and stories of their own families. A young physician thanked her for reminding him why he had chosen medicine in the first place. A retired military officer admitted that he had spent years believing strength meant hiding emotion until he heard her speak about kindness, Parents introduced their children, encouraging them to greet the graceful elderly woman whose quiet wisdom had become the heart of the evening. Margaret welcomed every conversation with patient attention, remembering names, asking thoughtful questions, and making each person feel as though they were the only one sitting across from her. Ethan remained nearby, speaking only occasionally, content to watch the extraordinary scene unfold. Throughout his life he had attended countless formal events where influential people competed for attention, yet he had never witnessed an entire ballroom transformed by something so simple. There were no speeches demanding generosity. There were no grand gestures seeking applause. There was only one woman choosing to make every person feel valued. The young hotel server returned once more, this time carrying a small plate of fresh pastries prepared by the kitchen. "The chef asked me to bring these to you," she said with a bright smile. "He heard what happened earlier and wanted to thank you for reminding all of us what hospitality truly means." Margaret accepted the plate with a quiet gratitude before inviting the young woman to sit beside her for a moment instead of hurrying back to work. At first the server hesitated, worried about leaving her responsibilities, but the restaurant manager approached with a reassuring nod. "Take a few minutes," he said kindly. "Tonight you are learning something far more valuable than another shift." The young woman smiled with relief and accepted the invitation. As they talked, Margaret asked about her family, her dreams, and what she hoped to accomplish in life. The answers came slowly at first, then with growing confidence. She dreamed of becoming a teacher one day but worried she could never afford to continue her education. Margaret listened carefully before reaching into her small evening handbag and removing an old fountain pen. "I carried this pen for many years while teaching," she said softly. "It has graded thousands of assignments and written countless encouraging notes. I would like you to keep it." The young server stared at the pen with surprise. "I cannot accept something so meaningful." Margaret gently closed the young woman's fingers around it. "The value is not in the pen. The value is in what you will write with it." Tears filled the young woman's eyes as she thanked her. Several nearby guests quietly witnessed the exchange, and more than one person found themselves unexpectedly moved. Ethan watched his mother give away something she had treasured for decades without the slightest hesitation. In that simple act he recognized the lesson she had taught him his entire life. Truly generous people never measure what they lose. They measure what another person gains. Looking around the ballroom, Ethan realized that no one was discussing his reputation anymore. Every conversation now centered on the extraordinary woman who had quietly reminded an entire room that the greatest influence in the world begins with making one person feel seen, heard, and genuinely loved. As the charity gala gradually drew toward its conclusion, no one seemed eager to leave. The elegant ballroom still glowed beneath crystal chandeliers, but the atmosphere felt entirely different from the one that had greeted guests only a few hours earlier. Conversations were no longer divided by influence, wealth, or reputation. Strangers spoke comfortably as though they had known one another for years. Business cards remained tucked inside jacket pockets while stories about families, childhood memories, favorite teachers, and shared dreams filled the room instead. Margaret quietly observed the transformation with peaceful satisfaction. She had not intended to become the center of the evening. She had simply responded to one frightened young woman with kindness, and somehow that single moment had spread from table to table until the entire ballroom seemed lighter. Ethan stood beside her, greeting guests who now approached not with nervous caution but with genuine warmth. Several community leaders thanked him for organizing such a meaningful event, yet nearly every conversation eventually returned to his mother. One businessman admitted that he had attended hundreds of formal galas but had never experienced an evening where people left feeling more connected than when they arrived. A philanthropist quietly confessed that she had spent years believing generosity was measured only through donations until Margaret reminded her that giving someone dignity could be just as valuable. The young hotel server returned one final time before the evening ended. She still carried the old fountain pen safely inside her apron pocket. "Mrs. Brooks," she said with a quiet emotion, "I called my mother during my break. I told her about the Korean word you taught me today. She asked me to thank you for reminding me that mistakes do not define a person. Margaret gently embraced the young woman, smiling with the same warmth that had transformed the evening. Remember, she whispered kindly, every person you meet is fighting a battle you cannot see. Lead with compassion first. The young woman nodded, determined never to forget those words. Nearby, several guests quietly witnessed the exchange and found themselves reflecting on their own lives. Some thought about strained family relationships. Others remembered teachers, parents, or grandparents whose patience had shaped them years earlier. Without planning to, the ballroom had become a place where people rediscovered gratitude. The event organizer eventually stepped onto the small stage to thank everyone for supporting the evening's charitable mission. Before she looked toward Margaret with sincere admiration. "Someti, miss," she said, "the greatest gift at any gathering is not the largest donation. It is the person who reminds us why kindness matters." The room responded with heartfelt applause. This time the applause was not for status or accomplishment. It was for character. Margaret looked almost embarrassed by the attention and simply bowed her head with a quiet humility. Ethan glanced around the ballroom, watching respected leaders, successful entrepreneurs, hotel staff, volunteers, and guests applauding together without distinction. For the first time that evening, no invisible walls remained between anyone. As the applause slowly faded, Margaret reached for her teacup before realizing it had long since grown cold. She smiled softly, not because the tea had been forgotten, but because something far more important had taken its place. Ethan looked at his mother with profound gratitude, knowing that every meaningful conversation filling the ballroom had begun with one gentle Korean word. Yet as they prepared to leave, Margaret quietly noticed one final person standing alone near the entrance, uncertain whether to come forward, and she rose from her chair with the same welcoming smile that had already changed so many hearts that evening. Margaret slowly walked toward the elderly gentleman standing quietly near the ballroom entrance. He held his hat respectfully in both hands, as though uncertain whether he belonged among the distinguished guests now preparing to leave. When he noticed Margaret approaching, he smiled apologetically. "I hope I am not interrupting," he said softly. "I was one of the maintenance workers assigned to this event. I finished my duties an hour ago, but I stayed because I heard everyone talking about you." Margaret welcomed him with the same gentle expression she had offered every person that evening. "Then I am very glad you stayed," she replied. "Please tell me your name." "My name is Walter," he answered. "I lost my wife 2 years ago. Since then, I have mostly kept to myself. Tonight was the first time in a long while that I felt like someone would be happy to speak with me." Margaret reached out and held his hand for a brief moment. "Walter," she said kindly, "thank you for giving me the opportunity to know you." Ethan watched the exchange from only a few feet away, recognizing that his mother treated a maintenance worker with exactly the same warmth she had shown governors, executives, donors, and business leaders. There was no difference in her voice, no difference in her smile, and no difference in the respect she offered. Several guests quietly noticed the conversation and naturally gathered nearby once again. Walter shared stories about his late wife, about the small garden they had planted together every spring, and about the grandchildren he hoped would visit more often. Margaret listened with sincere attention, occasionally asking thoughtful questions that encouraged him to continue. By the time he finished speaking, the sadness on his face had softened into peaceful gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered. "Tonight I remembered what it feels like to be seen." Margaret smiled warmly. Every person deserves that feeling. As the final guests prepared to leave, many returned one last time to thank Margaret personally. The young hotel server embraced her gently before promising she would become the kind of teacher who made every child feel safe. The nonprofit director promised to begin every volunteer orientation with a lesson about compassion instead of procedures. The businessman who had once been too intimidated to approach her admitted he planned to call his elderly mother first thing the next morning. Quiet acts of kindness had already begun traveling beyond the walls of the ballroom. Outside, The cool Chicago evening welcomed Ethan and Margaret as they stepped into the waiting car. For several moments they simply watched the city lights reflecting across the river in comfortable silence. Finally Ethan looked toward his mother with a quiet admiration. "People have respected me for many years," he said thoughtfully. "Tonight they loved you after only a few conversations." Margaret turned toward her son and smiled with the same peaceful wisdom that had guided him since childhood. "Respect built on influence may open a door," she said softly. "But kindness invites people to walk through it." Ethan nodded slowly, allowing her words to settle deep within his heart. As the car disappeared into the glowing city streets, the ballroom behind them remained filled with people who would remember that evening for reasons no one had expected. They would remember an elderly mother who transformed fear into friendship without raising her voice, without asking for attention, and without seeking recognition. All she offered was one gentle Korean word, one patient smile, and one open heart. And on that unforgettable night, everyone who entered the ballroom believing power was the greatest force in the room left understanding that genuine kindness had always been stronger. The world moved forward as it always does, but every life touched by Margaret carried a quieter truth from that evening onward, because sometimes the smallest word spoken with the greatest compassion becomes the lesson a person remembers for the rest of their life.